Hello, I'm Larry Hurtado. I'm Emeritus Professor of New Testament in the University of Edinburgh. And I'm going to be talking to you today about what I think of as the first of the three major revolutions in book technology. This is a revolution that takes a few centuries in the Roman period. It's the shift from the book roll to the Codex. And the Codex is the early form of what we know as our familiar leaf-bound book. Let's think first of all about the writing material used in the Roman period. There are two basic types of writing material used. One was various kinds of skins, say from goats or sheep or cattle. And the other type was papyrus, from which we get our word paper. Papyrus is a plant that grows in watery regions like along the Nile, and to various heights. But what they would do is take the papyrus stalk, cut it into thin strips, and lay these strips side by side, say vertically, and then another layer of the same sort of material laid perpendicular to the other, and then a weight pressed upon them. And the green papyrus emitted a kind of glue, a kind of a juice that when it dried was glue. And so the two layers would be forced to glue together and form a quite solid, substantial piece of writing material. These would be prepared into rectangular pieces likewise, and then these rectangular pieces glued together to form a successive roll of writing material. I have here just sort of a piece of paper that we've used, a short piece of paper, just to illustrate what I mean. It would come to you in a roll, so you would unroll it, and you would lay out on the writing material tall, narrow writing spaces on which the writing would go. The first part of the roll would be left blank because when you rolled it up, this material would serve as your protective sheets on the outer side. The outer edge of a roll was always the part that was most likely to be damaged. So it was left blank, the first bit of it. And then, however, the writing columns would start moving from left to right. And Greek written, for example, reads from left to right, as does English and most European languages, and then down the column. You left margins on top and bottom. Usually the bottom margin was measurably longer than the top margin. Tall, narrow columns, about 8 to 10 centimeters wide, and then a bit of space between that and the next column, and so on. So here's an example of sort of three successive writing columns and how they would, and about the size that they would look on a roll. And by the way, the height of the roll that I'm used here is an average height of for a literary text in the Roman period. As I've said, the book roll involved tall, narrow columns. Two things to say about it. One is that when you hold a roll open like this, as you did, you find that that's just about a comfortable width to hold something open without stretching your shoulders too much or pushing them in. It's quite a comfortable stance to hold a roll. The other thing that we've noticed more recently is that the width of the typical writing column, as I say, about 8 or 9 centimeters usually, something like that, is what we've discovered is about the width that the experienced reader can take in without moving the eye. And so what it means is that you didn't have to make eye movements going across a line of type. You could simply look at each line in the column with one blick, one look at the line. The other thing to say is that in order to ease your way down the line, when you did the column, each successive line was set just a little bit to the left of the preceding line, about 1 character or half a character or so. And what that did was that it aided the eye. As you went around from one to the next, it was easy to find the next column because it was just a little bit left of where the preceding one was. So it was quite carefully done. And when you look at one of these high quality manuscripts, you can see that they were set up with a great deal of skill. One of the big changes that occurs and the big revolution we're going to be talking about now is the revolution, so to speak, the move from the book roll to the Codex, the ancestor of our modern leaf book. We don't have an actual ancient codex that we can put out here on the table, but let me show you a couple of things that will illustrate what a codex actually looked like. Here's a replica leaf, a full-size and visually exact replica of a leaf from an ancient codex. This one is from a copy of the letters or epistles of the Apostle Paul, which form a number of the writings in the New Testament. This one happens to be from a part of Paul's first letter to Corinth, or 1 Corinthians as it's sometimes known. And what you have here is a replica of one page from one folio. So remember, this would be one half of a folded sheet. There would be another sheet behind this originally. This is continuous writing with no word separation. The left column, here's the left-hand column, is justified. In this case, notice the right column is a little more ragged, where the guy chose to break the line and start the next line. The interline spacing, or the leading, as we would say, is quite generous, probably to facilitate reading of each line. Unlike the book roll, which tended to have each line starting just a little bit to the left, that's not so apparent here. It looks like a much more of a true justified column, although sometimes the initial characters are a bit larger, probably again to aid the reading of it. Here's an example, again, of photographic facsimile of a later codex. This one is a photographic facsimile of the famous Codex Sinaiticus, a codex of the entire Bible, actually, Old Testament, Christian Bible, Old Testament and New Testament in one parchment codex, not papyrus, but parchment. This dates from the 4th century AD, at a time when parchment had begun to be used, or leather skin had begun to be used more dominantly for book construction, and papyrus was beginning to wane, and also a time when the codex had begun to be supreme. By the 4th century, at least to judge from the indexes of extant manuscripts that we have, by the 4th century, about 60 to 65% of our cataloged manuscripts from that period are codexes. So the tipping point has come, and the codex has begun to be supreme. So let me open this and show you something of what this is like. Now here you have an elegantly laid out, and this is full size, so this would have been the size of the original here, and it's a photograph of the parchment with even some of the staining you will see on it. Notice what they've done here. It is interesting. This is a really elegant, prepared, codex, not for ordinary usage, but probably for putting into a church or something like that for official purposes. And notice what they've done is, even though it's a codex with this large pages, they've laid out the writing in these tall, narrow columns of the sort that we associate with a roll. And again, notice, even though the codex has become the dominant book form, the visual properties of the roll are still highly prized. By the 4th century AD, the codex is beginning to outnumber the book roll. Christians, for example, preferred the codex for their scriptures. Jews, at the same time, using the same scriptures and studying them just as closely and wanting to reference them just as diligently, steadfastly preferred the roll as an obviously superior book form. So we have to ask the question then, why did the codex become dominant? It's interesting that the actual triumph of the codex as a dominant book form overall, happens first in the 4th century. At that period, about 60-65% or so of our extant manuscripts are codexes. And the question we have to ask is it coincidental that the triumph of the codex, the tipping point, happens in connection with what is often referred to as the triumph of Christianity? Christianity was an oppressed and a marginalized religious movement all through the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century AD. Early in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine relents and actually gives Christianity a legitimate status, and then a few decades later it becomes actually the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it's in that same period when the Codex triumphs. So scholars have actually wondered, is it possible that it's the cultural supremacy or triumph of Christianity that actually contributes in some kind of way toward the triumph of the Codex as a book form? Interesting question, that the leaf book with which we're so familiar may have become the supreme book form or the more established book form because of this influence and triumph of Christianity.